Good evening and welcome. My name is Kent Doty and I am with the Audubon Society of Lincoln City, who is co-host for this evening's program. Lincoln City Audubon has been serving Lincoln and Tillamook counties since 2006. Find out more about us, upcoming events like the Christmas bird count, and community science projects, as well as conservation news at lincolncityaudubon.org. And I have a co-host who will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessie Jones, and I am the volunteer coordinator for Coastwatch. Coastwatch is a program of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition was founded in 1971 to protect the public interest in Oregon's beaches, created by the Beach Bill. We are celebrating 50 years this year, and we are celebrating some successes as well. So check out our website. You can go to the next slide. Like I said, I'm the volunteer coordinator for Coastwatch. We are a mile-by-mile beach adoption program on the Oregon coast, all the way from Fort Stevens down to Crissey Field State Park on the California border. Volunteers adopt a mile with us, and then I introduce them to a number of scientists and researchers to get deeper involved with citizen science on their miles. And I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm excited for the program. Thanks, Kent.
Okay, this is the second in a three-part series of webinars entitled Beyond the Beach that explores our nearshore environment along the Oregon coast. Be sure and register for upcoming events and start the new year off by joining us on January 12th at 6:30 p.m. to learn about Oregon's mysterious undersea kelp forests. Subtitle ecologist Sarah Hamilton from Oregon State University will share her passion and knowledge about the underwater landscape of kelp forests and how it's changing. And tonight's program is being recorded. The topic for this evening is Oregon's Rocky Coast. We have a great panel of experts who will share on the how, where, and why of various marine designations. Oregon's legendary 1967 Beach Bill really sets our state as unique and provides public access, free and uninterrupted public access to Oregon beaches. But how well protected is the rest of Oregon's shoreline? While the offshore islands are protected in the refuge and beach access is assured, much of Oregon's shoreline below the ordinary high tide line lacks site-specific protection measures. 41% of Oregon's 362-mile coastline is rocky habitat, with little of it having site-specific protection. While the areas you hear about tonight are vitally important for the health of our coastal ecosystem, it's also illuminating to understand that they are a small portion of the total coast. And these map panels of the coast, you can see that the uniqueness of the places that we'll hear about tonight cover a small portion of the coast. Marine reserves in the pink, marine gardens, research areas, and offshore islands, although important, comprise a small portion of the total coast. So let's hear from our guest speakers about these special places and how these designations came to be and what's in store for the future. On our panel, we have Dave Fox, who leads the Resource Assessment Management section within the Marine Resources Program at ODFW. His background is in marine ecology and marine resource management. He has worked extensively in Oregon's intertidal and subtidal habitats. He's been with ODFW for 32 years and lived on the Oregon coast for 40 years. We also have Roy Lowe joining us. He is a resident of Walport and a distinguished photographer. He was employed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 37 years and was a project leader for the Oregon's Islands National Wildlife Refuge Complex upon his retirement. And rounding it out is Dick Vanderchef, who is Associate Conservation Director for the Coast and Marine Program of the Nature Conservancy of Oregon, where he focuses on marine reserves, estuary restoration, and coastal conservation issues. Dick has worked for the Nature Conservancy for over 36 years as an ecologist in the conservation and protection of work across the state. This is a 1-hour program. It'll include a Q&A session after all the panelists present. During the presentation, you're encouraged to put your questions and comments down in the Q&A or chat tabs at the bottom, and we will visit those at the end of the presentation. You can also raise your virtual hand during the Q&A session. Please remain muted during the presentation. And with that, I will kick it off to our esteemed panelists and Dave Fox.
All right. Let me share my screen here. And can you see it yet?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. Okay, great. Because I can't see it on my end here, so I have to check. Anyway, thank you. I'm really excited to start this off to talk about management of Oregon's rocky intertidal or Oregon's rocky habitats. Just to check, did the slide advance?
Oh, actually, it looks like, Dave, we're seeing two screens, so you need to bring one forward.
Okay, let me, sorry, let me do this again. Yeah, I accidentally did a user error there and shared my whole desktop.
There we go.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that.
No
All right,
problem.
Start right in. My presentation, I'm going to talk about kind of the what and where of Oregon's rocky habitats, and my talk's really going to focus on rocky intertidal areas. I'll discuss rocky habitat management and then get into the site designations that Kent referred to earlier. So I generally, and many of us generally, kind of divide Oregon's marine rocky habitats into three general categories. The first being rocky intertidal, which are the areas between high and low tide. So it's kind of a thin strip along the shoreline. There's rocky subtidal, which are the submerged rocky reefs that are offshore. And then there's the offshore rocks and islands that are emerge above the water surface. So looking at the rocky intertidal, as Kent said, it's about 41% of Oregon's shoreline. And while that encompasses a lot of miles of shoreline, if you look at this map on the right, there's actually covers very little surface area. These rocky intertidal areas shown in pink here are just thin strips along the shore. So a lot of linear miles, but not a lot of area. These areas are ecologically very important. They have high biodiversity, especially of invertebrates and algae, a lot of organisms that really specifically adapted to live in this environment. They're very productive. They provide nursery areas. They provide haul outs for seals and sea lions, kind of a number of important ecological functions. In addition, they have high social value. There's a lot of public access, a lot of visitation, education programs that occur at these sites. Many people, this is their main and in many cases only access to view kind of the Oregon's marine environment. They also provide living laboratories. A lot of research occurs in these areas. A lot of our present understanding of marine ecology comes from research that has occurred in rocky intertidal habitat. So there's also, as I said, the subtidal rocky habitat, or what we commonly refer to as rocky reefs, shown in the map on the right in red. These areas are important to fisheries, or again, they're also highly productive, highly diverse. These are subject to protection in our Marine Reserves program, and Dick will be talking about that later. And then, as I said, the third category of offshore rocks and islands. Again, very important areas for seabirds and a number of other wildlife species. And Roy will be talking about those in his presentation. So why do we need to manage rocky habitat? Well, first, as I mentioned, is the ecological and social importance. They're ecological hotspots with diverse communities, high human use, high cultural importance, especially for tribal nations. And for the offshore reefs, they're very important to fisheries, so there's kind of a high economic importance as well. They're also relatively scarce habitat. If you look at the subtidal area of Oregon's Territorial Sea, so the Territorial Sea is kind of the 3-mile band of ocean that offshore of Oregon. only about 7% of that area is rocky, so rocky reef environments. And that scarcity is really magnified if you just look at intertidal areas. So the rocky intertidal areas, it's only about 1,300 acres total of rocky intertidal habitat in Oregon. And that really comprises less than 0.2% of the territorial sea. So very, very scarce habitat, which, you know, amplifies its importance. These are also vulnerable areas, and a lot of the reason they're vulnerable is because of the high human use and the scarcity of the habitat. So you don't want to be impacting an area that's, you know, that's that rare in the environment. And then also we've been seeing a lot of evidence of climate and ocean change affecting these areas. A lot of you have heard about current reductions in kelp beds and abalone, and I'm sure Sarah Hamilton next month will be talking about that. This has been attributed largely to ocean heat waves that have happened in the last few years. We also have evidence of acidification and hypoxia affecting these environments. Again, these are climate and ocean change factors. And also, it's very possible that Oregon is, especially the coast with its cool climate, may be a kind of a future refuge for people escaping warmer climates as they heat up. So that'll increase the population on the Oregon coast, which will again increase the human use and visitation of these areas. So looking at our current management program for rocky habitat, it really starts with the Territorial C Plan. And this plan provides a framework for coastal resource management in Oregon's Territorial Sea, again, the first 3 miles of the ocean, including the shoreline. This plan is developed by the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, which is a legislatively created body that advises the governor and state agencies on ocean management issues. And the plan provides kind of the overarching policies and management standards and program recommendations for management. So a key component of this plan is the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy, and we're just finishing up a 3-year revision process. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience were involved in that. The strategy is a long, complex document, but just in general, its objectives revolve around maintaining and protecting rocky habitats in their communities through a number of different mechanisms, collaboration, education, stewardship, regulations, research, etc. The strategy includes coast-wide management principles and policies that apply to all areas, and then these site-specific management designations, which provide additional protection to particular sites. OPAC and the plan itself don't really have any implementation authority, so the plan is implemented by the individual state agencies in accordance with their individual jurisdictions. I'm not going to really go through this, but there's a number of state agencies that have different jurisdictions and different roles in implementing the plan. Federal agencies are involved as well, especially where there's land ownership by the agencies. And then in addition to the state and federal government, tribes, local governments, NGOs, and volunteer organizations all play a role in implementing the strategy. So the methods of management or the mechanisms is both regulatory and non-regulatory. On the regulatory side, there are coast-wide regulations that apply to all sites, regardless of whether or not they're in a management designation. Example from my agency, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, we have fishery regulations that set limits and seasons and those sorts of regulations to manage areas. And there's also the site designations. Those are the specific areas with more restrictive regulations, including harvest regulations. And the main management areas I'll be talking about are marine gardens, marine research areas, and marine conservation areas. And again, Dick will be talking about marine reserves. And there's a number of other regulatory mechanisms for managing these areas. On the non-regulatory side, probably the main one is education and stewardship, and that's either through groups or programs or maybe things as simple as signs or pamphlets that basically let the public know, the best way to enjoy their visit to the area while minimizing impacts, or really providing that information to try to minimize impacts. Also, on a non-regulatory side, upland site manager may make decisions on access to sites, where to improve access or not improve access, which could have big implications on how sites are used or how frequently they're visited. And then there's also many areas that are, say, at the base of a big cliff or some other kind of inaccessible area that provide just kind of a natural protection due to the geography of the site. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be talking about the site designations. As I said, the Territorial C Plan delineates these designations, and the agencies implement them through regulatory and non-regulatory mechanisms. And from ODF&W's standpoint, we actually designate these sites and then implement them through our harvest regulations. And so if you look at the current regulations as of today, there are 14 designated sites, 7 marine gardens, 6 research areas, 1 marine conservation area. And then there's 2 more sites that have just recently approved by OPAC that will be added next year, basically, in our regulations, as a new marine garden at Coquille Point and a new marine research area at Cape Blanco. In addition to these, OPAC will be considering 6 more sites in 2022, so early next year, some additional sites that were proposed in our revision process to the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy, and they're taking some further review, so those will be considered later on. And then in addition to these sites, the marine reserves and marine protect areas encompass additional rocky intertidal habitat, so they protect additional habitat. And if you total it all up for the existing sites, about 30% of Oregon's rocky habitat is in some intertidal habitat, is in some sort of protected area. Looking at the categories of our designations, there's first of all the marine gardens. These are generally high use areas or popular tide pooling areas. Many of them are located in where they have easy access near population centers. Our main regulatory management is restricting invertebrate and algae harvest at these sites to help maintain the communities. And then from the non-regulatory side, many of these sites have interpretive programs. Some of them run by agencies, some run by volunteer organizations. In one case, a local government, Cannon Beach, runs the Haystack Brock Awareness Program, for example. The sites shown in black are the existing marine gardens, the locations of those. And then the red one there is the new one, Coquille Point, which is also shown in the photograph. Just wanted to kind of show some aerial images of at least some of the marine gardens. This is 4 of those 7, just to kind of give you an idea of the variety of landscapes, and also show some of these are located right directly adjacent to residential areas or commercial areas. So helps explain why there's such high use and such popular areas to visit. Research areas, these are areas that have traditionally been used by researchers and educators. In the past, there was many of these areas had very, almost excessive amounts of invertebrate collection for educational purposes. That's really been curtailed in the last several years. The main management is to restrict excessive collection of invertebrates. And there's a scientific permit program that is the main mechanism for doing that. Shown in black are the existing locations of the research areas, and then the red one, Cape Blanco, is the new one that was just recently approved by OPAC, and that's also shown in the photograph. There are, as I said, 6 existing ones and the 1 new one, and this just shows some examples of the existing research areas. And this one in the Cape Arago is our largest one. And if you can see the cursor, really the whole shoreline pretty much in this photograph is part of the Cape Arago research area. Finally, marine conservation area. These were formerly called habitat refuges. And there's one currently. More, again, part of those 6 sites that will be considered by OPAC are proposed marine conservation areas. The general goal of the marine conservation area is to conserve the natural system to the highest degree possible by limiting impacts. Whale Cove doesn't allow a harvest of invertebrates, algae, or fish, and it's applied both to the intertidal and subtidal areas of the cove, which is shown in the photograph there. And I just wanted to wrap up by showing a timeline of site designation history. And when I show this, it surprises a lot of people that there's actually a 60-year history of these site designations. The first were designated in 1962. Seven sites were designated research areas or marine garden. This came about. It's kind of an interesting history. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it came about with a group of citizens and a group of OSU professors approaching the legislature and asking them to do something about excessive collection at these sites, and resulted in a new legislation that gave our agency jurisdiction over all the marine invertebrates at these sites, and then our commission, our agency, adopted these sites in 1962. Number of sites added during the year. This kind of group I'm circling here with my cursor came with the 1994 original adoption of the Territorial C Plan, and then these final two are the current revision of the Territorial C Plan. And again, there's additional sites being considered. I also included the marine reserves and marine protection areas on this timeline just so you could get an idea of the timing of those. And with that, I guess we're holding questions to the end. So that ends my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. That was very, very informative. Next up, Dick.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can, Dick, and I've asked you to, start your video. Great, super.
Okay, perfect. So thanks again for inviting me to speak tonight with these austere other programs who are great people who are well versed in these topics. I'm going to be talking about the marine reserves and protecting biological diversity at these sites. If I can get these slides to advance, let me see. Well, I'm not having luck getting things to advance, unfortunately. Let's see.
Are you trying your mouse as well as your keyboard?
I'm not even using a mouse. There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, it's going way forward. So let's try going backwards. Okay, here we go. Keyboard is working now. So I'm going to talk tonight about the history of the marine protected areas in general, MPAs we call them. MPAs are sort of a general term for all sorts of protections in the water, including marine reserves. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of marine reserves, what they do and why we are focused on them. And then I'm going to spend most of the time looking at the Oregon Marine Reserve Program and the sites that are encompassed. And then just a minute or so to wrap up talking about the evaluation that's going to be coming here in a year or so. So first off, marine conservation really got its start, in my mind, in the 50s and the 60s, of course, with Jacques Cousteau, who made it very popular to all of us who were reading National Geographic and other things, that there was this world under the sea. And in particular, of course, he focused our attention on coral reefs and that. That was really where a lot of marine conservation ideas were beginning to be looked at seriously. But I think a lot of things came to a head for us here on the West Coast in particular, when we started hearing about oil spills and the impact of oil spills, particularly the oil spills in California along Santa Barbara, that we saw, thousands of oiled seabirds and habitat that was impacted. And sort of at that time in the mid 60s, these oil spills were occurring. And later, that really started focusing a lot on marine conservation in the temperate seas as well. And that really kicked into a big way of effects here in Oregon in terms of getting moving on conservation issues. So first off, a little definition for marine reserves. This is the marine reserves are the most highly protected category or designation that you can put in a marine area. The Oregon definition is pretty much standard use around the world. It's basically an area that's protected from all extractive activities. This includes the removal or disturbance of living and non-living marine resources, in other words, organisms, algae, etc. And also it means that there is no development in these areas. So these areas are also protected from any sorts of marine and renewable energy facilities or sightings that may occur. And there is some necessary monitoring and research that has to evaluate the condition that sometimes does impact the sites to a minor degree. But again, these are issues that are regulated pretty carefully as such. Marine protected areas, again, are sort of an umbrella category. They have varying sorts of regulations that are associated with them. Most of the marine protected areas in Oregon that we'll talk about later are highly protected with some limited fishing that's allowed extraction-wise, but there is still no development that's allowed within these areas. So no renewable energy can be sited within the marine protected areas either. So why do we look to protect these areas in the sea? Well, the classic example that you hear on the West Coast anyway are to protect these varying species of rockfish in particular that are quite diverse. And we often cite this example of BOFs, big old fat female fish. And this sort of pejorative term really refers to the life history of many rockfish, in that as they age, and they can be quite long-lived, sometimes living as long as 75 years, as they age, their productivity increases dramatically. And so a fish that may not seem too much bigger than the next fish may be considerably older and may have much greater reproductive capacity than a slightly smaller fish. So you can see this example here of a vermilion rockfish, that the larger fish on the right can actually put out many more babies than the fish on the far left. And so one of the things with reserves that marine reserves do is they protect all age groups or abundances of these fish, and thus allows for restoration of these diverse age groups in that, as well as there also is great increases in biomass and density and richness. Now, marine reserves, of course, also serve many other functions. They certainly provide for diversity of all sorts of species. They certainly provide for habitat diversity, which includes the rocky intertidal and rocky reef habitats that Dave was talking about earlier. And they provide for juvenile dispersal and connectivity issues between reserves and also within reserves. And finally, because a lot of the species that occur within these areas, they actually move into deeper habitats. When they age, they allow for this little bits of migration with maturity as well, because marine reserves typically run from the shoreline out to the state water boundary, which is at 3 nautical miles. All marine reserves are within state waters. That's one thing we need to remember as we go forward. So how do we get to the Marine Reserve Program here in Oregon? Oregon does things its unique way, which is oftentimes involving citizens in a big way. But really the Marine Reserve Program began with Goal 19, which was the ocean conservation goal of our land use planning process. Goal 19 says that we should try and conserve our ocean resources. And as we move forward there for a couple of decades into the late 90s, there was quite a call to actually begin establishing marine reserves and marine protected areas in Oregon waters. This resulted in 2002 with the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, or OPAC, recommending to the governor that we should do so. And then finally, in 2008, there was an executive order that came down from the governor telling OPAC to set up a process to establish marine reserves. OPAC initiated a citizen process again, and so the citizens of the state nominated 20 sites up and down the Oregon coast as marine reserves. And if you ever have any wonder about the conservation intent of Oregon citizens, those 20 sites actually comprised half of the coastline, which was a very, very ambitious ask at the time. So those 20 sites were sort of scaled down to a number that was maybe deemed feasible. They were scaled down to 6 sites. At that time, 2 sites were immediately put forward to the legislature to be recommended as pilot marine reserves. And then 4 other sites were further evaluated in 2010 by community teams under various guises that eventually resulted in legislation in 2012. So all in all, the process took approximately 10 years, and we ended up with 5 marine reserves, 9 marine protected areas on the Oregon coast. So again, here are these sites, just a quick map to show you where they are located. The sites occur from the north coast at Cape Falcon, which is offshore from Oswald West State Park, all the way down to Redfish Rocks on the south coast at Port Orford. In between is Cascade Head, Otter Rock, and Cape Perpetua. Most of these sites have a marine reserve shown in red with a bordering marine protected area shown in blue. Only Otter Rock, which is a very small site just located north of Newport, does not have an associated marine protected area. Overall, these sites comprise approximately 9% of the territorial sea, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. Then in 10 years, we ended up with designations that address 10% of this state waters that are offshore of Oregon. And while the initial ideas were that these sites would be something that could be evaluated against each other, the sites were found to be so unique in many ways, and as we look at them more carefully and through research and monitoring, now we consider them actually case studies. One thing we should know is that this whole marine reserve program is actually managed by the Oregon Department of Wildlife, Fish and Wildlife, and but it also includes territories that are managed by Department of State Lands, DSL, as well as state parks. And so it's actually a consortium of state departments that are involved in the managing of the site. And then finally, the state police are responsible for compliance and enforcement of the regulations of these sites. So it's actually quite a host of state agencies. So the program goals are such that the primary program goal is conservation. The primary goal, again, is to conserve habitats and biological diversity that's found at these sites. In addition, a very interesting goal, a really important goal, is that the sites serve as scientific reference areas, and actually as a framework for scientific research and monitoring in the near shore. This has proved to be really important because we really, even though there has been a good amount of research looking at this area, nothing has been as organized there is nowadays when we have these 5 sites that are being looked at intensively as well as in a coordinated fashion. So we're actually getting some really good information from these sites because we now have coordinated research ongoing at all 5 sites. And then finally, the marine reserves, an important program goal is to avoid significant impacts, adverse impacts to ocean users and coastal communities. So communities have been involved from the get-go. There was great concern from OPAC and from the advisors to the process to ensure that the reserves did not have negative impacts that would actually stay with us for a long time. So there's been considerable also monitoring going on within the social economic factors within these communities too. So a quick view now of looking at some of the marine reserves, or looking at all the reserves here. From north to south, Cape Falcon on the north coast. Cape Falcon is really the second largest marine reserve. One interesting fact about this site is it's the only reserve that actually is affected by the Columbia River plume, which is a plume of fresh water that sweeps over the reserve and provides a slightly different oceanographic features at this site. Of course, Cape Falcon is also well known for Oswald West State Park, which is one of the most heavily recreated state parks in our system. Over 1 million visitors a year visit this park, and so basically are down there at the marine reserve on a yearly basis. There's also, of course, offshore, a small MPA. To the south is Cascade Head. Cascade Head is a marine reserve that's bracketed on all 3 sides, north, south, and west, by marine protected areas. Cascade Head, of course, has a major estuary at Salmon River flowing into it. And Cascade Head Marine Reserve is also well known because it occupies the northern tip of the largest offshore reef, the Siletz Reef. And so there had been considerable fishing pressure at Cascade Head Marine Reserve and also in the South End Marine Protected Area at the time. Otter Rock is the smallest marine reserve sitting offshore from the town of Otter Rock. And it's well known for its intertidal features, and because it's a nearshore reserve, it has extensive subtidal habitat that is actually quite diverse. There's a lot of intertidal rocky habitat as well as sandy beach to the south end. And this site has been, of course, observed, and actually a lot of people can actually get down to the site because the access is very good. So there's a lot of interest at this site on the Central Coast. Farther down the Central Coast is the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. Cape Perpetua sits immediately adjacent to the Cape Perpetua Scenic Area, which is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. So we have a U.S. federal presence on the shore side of this area. One of the most interesting features about the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve is the seabird protection area, which sits offshore and south of the actual marine reserve. The marine reserve here is shown in red, of course. The seabird protection area is focused on protecting seabirds that forage in this area. So there's no take of herring and things. So, but this is a very important feature here. And finally, at the south coast, we have the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve. Redfish Rocks is one of the pilot reserves along with Otter Rock. This site is well known because there are the 5 offshore rocks that encompass it, as well as offshore MPA. It was also a heavily fished reserve, but it's very diverse and also occupies some of the deepest habitat that we find in our reserve system. So what's up next for marine reserves? As I said, we're facing a 2023 10-year review of the site, of these sites in the program. ODFW is developing a synthesis report for this review that's evaluating, that's summarizing all their monitoring that's been going on over the years. There's going to be an evaluation of this report by a university. In this case, it's going to be Oregon State University. It's going to be evaluating it, looking at if there are management plans produced, the monitoring, compliance, and then actually making some recommendations. And then the legislature will certainly rely upon this review by the university and the report to make its own determination of how the program has been doing. So we're all looking forward to that evaluation here in 2023. And thank you for your time.
Wow, Dick, that was a really great encapsulation of marine reserves. Thank you. And now to hear from Roy. And Roy, you're muted.
Okay, there. Tonight I'm going to talk about the National Wildlife Refuges along the Oregon coast. And 2 refuges encompass almost all the rocks, reefs, and islands along the coast that are above the surface of the sea. There's 1 or 2 exceptions to that, but we'll start off with, if I could advance the slide here. Okay, we'll start off with 3 arch rocks in the lower left of the screen. There's 3 large rocks and 6 smaller rocks, only encompassing about 15 acres, but at its peak had about 250,000 nesting seabirds. And for geographic location here, you can see Tillamook Bay in the upper right there. We have great thanks to William L. Finley and Herman Bowman, pioneer Oregon naturalists that traveled 3 arch rocks in 1901 and 1903, and they actually camped out on the rocks and had these large cameras and photographed the tremendous wildlife was there. They also documented the demise of the seabirds there through target practicing. Boats would come down and shoot seabirds all day long simply for target practice. And so in 1904, Finley got on a train and went to Washington, D.C., talked his way into the White House, and convinced Teddy Roosevelt something needed to be done about this in terms of long-term protection. And so in 1907, through executive order, Teddy Roosevelt created Three Arch Rocks Bird Reservation, which was a precursor to national wildlife refuges. And this was only the 7th refuge in the nation at that point, and the first one west of the Mississippi River. And in fact, you could consider this the first marine protected area in Oregon and probably the entire West Coast. You can see some of the other rocks that are part of Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge that I'll get to in a minute. And then Cape Meares, a portion of Cape Meares is a National Wildlife Refuge, as well as a research natural area. And other federal designations, Oregon Islands is also national wilderness, as is Three Arch Rocks. This is the Western Rock or Shag Rock, Three Arch Rocks, and just trying to demonstrate the tremendous wildlife there. This black and white stippling across the top and on all these ledges is about 121,000 common merge breeding. And this is what their colony looks like up close. Very, very dense colony site there. This is a view looking towards the east, and the largest rock at the bottom there we call Finley Rock, and it's got that vegetated slope where puffins breed. And I was astounded to learn that in 1913 they estimated 10,000 tufted puffins breeding at Three Arch Rocks, which is just phenomenal. In 1979, 4,000 were estimated. When I first surveyed it in 1988, we were down to 2,700. And today, maybe 100 birds breed there. And these birds all along the Eastern Pacific are declining in a dramatic fashion. And there's no smoking gun at this point, but it's believed to be associated with changes in the marine ecosystem. In the 90s, we had lots of disturbance events with boats getting right up next to the rocks and flushing birds off their nests, and eggs and chicks rolling into the water. And we even had boats going through the tunnels of the island. And this cave is so large that commercial charter boats would go through there at the end of the day to give their clients a thrill. And yeah, it's pretty thrilling, but all these seabirds were being blown off their nests there. So in 1993, we worked cooperatively with Fish and Wildlife to document the disturbance going on there. And in fact, we recorded 68 disturbance events by watercraft and 100 by low-flying aircraft. We took these results to OPAC, and they agreed that we needed to have protection around the rocks as well as the rocks. And so in 1994, the Oregon State Marine Board closed the waters to watercraft within 500 feet of the rocks. And you can see the area that this encompasses down here. And this is a seasonal closure when the seabirds are there. And it was the first, and still today, the only marine waters closure in the state of Oregon. Now, I should state that on Three Arch Rocks and all the rocks and islands within Oregon Islands, the public is never allowed to climb on them and do things because it's very obviously disturbing to the seabirds, marine mammals. There's fragile habitat, native plants. And so those sites are always off limits. This is Goat Island near Harris Beach and Brookings, and it was the very first rock that was established as part of Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. All the rocks and islands along the coast were part of the Outer Continental Shelf management by the Bureau of Land Management for potential for exploitation of oil, gas, and minerals. And that was set aside a long time ago, and it became obvious that there were no oil and gas and mineral interests in these rocks and islands. So we began transferring those lands from the Bureau of Land Management to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or managed as a refuge. But this was the very first rock in the refuge in 1935, and it's 21 acres, so it's the largest rock or island we have in the state of Oregon on the coastline. Interestingly, the precursor to that, the Rogue River seen here, the Rogue River Reef, and the Blanco and Orford Reefs, in 1931, they were designated as sanctuary for stellar sea lions. And that's great, but the legislation failed to name an agency to administer or manage that. So basically it was a sanctuary on paper until much later they were transferred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the refuge system. So the refuge runs for the California border, which is located in the far background and includes about 1,854 rocks and islands. This is the southern end, and it stretches all the way up to Tillamook Head. And you can barely see in the background there the Columbia River. And so to be within the refuge, the rocks and islands have to be above the surface of the water and separated from the mainland. So you can see that's easy call right here. And here that's separated, but this rock is actually attached, so it's not part of the refuge system. So the refuge goes from mean high water all the way up to the top of each rock. And it's a little tough to know where mean high water is. You'd have to really do a topographic measurement. But one thing you can use is barnacles grow about to the top about where the marine high water is. So you can see the barnacles below this red line and none above. And so that's a pretty good line for determining where the refuge is. So on this rock, above the rock is part of the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. And below that is state lands administered by various agencies, depending on the resources. So this is a Tillamook Rock. It was actually sold to a private entity, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service obtained a conservation easement on this rock in perpetuity to protect the wildlife. And as you can see, it's working here. There's somewhere over 1,000 stellar and California sea lions hauled out here. And this is just a view looking down the coast. One of these rocks and islands has some sort of wildlife value, whether it's seabird breeding colony, a pupping site for harbor seals or haul out for seals, roosting sites for various shorebirds and seabirds. Just about every rock has some value. And this is Haystack Rock at Cannon Beach, and you can see it is connected at low tide and focus of a lot of attention. So there's a friends group there that works to educate the public and protect the marine garden as well as refuge. And mean high tide would be somewhere up here where you see this dry sand. So you can see that this high tide, this is surrounded by water. Looking south, the rocks off of Silver Point with Cape Falcon in the background, all sorts of different sizes and shapes. This is Haystack Rock at Pacific City. So there's actually 3 officially named Haystack Rocks. This is number 2. It's actually the tallest rock in Oregon as well. It serves as a major seabird colony, and it's also the nighttime roost for a very rare group of geese called Samiti Islands Aleutian cackling geese. There's only somewhere between 140 and 160 in the world, and this is where they sleep at night. And we work with a variety of state and federal agencies in managing the refuge. This is Yaquina Head, managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and you can see all the whitewashed rocks with seabirds on it surrounding the headland. Those are all part of Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. Same at Hasita Head, state lands, the state parks, managing the lighthouse and the adjacent land, and the rocks and islands here are part of the refuge. Similarly, this is Cape Arago, and you saw the picture, some pictures of this through Dave's slideshow. And we've got Simpson Reef out here, a major marine mammal haul-out site. And this is Island Rock, just south of the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve. Interestingly, in the 1800s, the seabirds' eggs were harvested here and shipped to San Francisco to feed the gold rush miners. And it was a big business, and eggs sold for about $1 a dozen, which was a lot of money in the 1800s. Hunter's Island, south of Cape Sebastian. This is an island with heavy vegetation, deep soils, and this is where we find our burrow nesting species of seabirds, things like tufted puffins, rhinoceros auklets, leeches, and fork-tailed storm petrels. They have to have these predator-free environments and deep soils where they nest underground. This is Mac Arch and a Mac Reef at Crook Point, major seabird area. And then when you get down in this Borden State Park area, the rocks are very numerous down there. And we see quite a few coniferous trees on some of the rocks and islands, which we really don't see on the north coast. We also have acquired 3 mainland sites. This is a site at Coquille Point in the town of Bandon. And this was acquired to prevent development right out to the point with hotels and bright lights and so forth next to these major seabird colonies on the rocks here. And this site is also used, public use for viewing seabirds and reading the interpreter panels. We have a friends group that helps the public understand marine resources here. And the Nature Conservancy helped us acquire Crook Point, which is seen here. Major seabird colonies right next to the beach, very fragile habitats, native prairie on the mainland, very unusual habitats. And it was really concerned about development there. In fact, there's a huge golf course resort proposal right adjacent to this headland that it's kind of on the back burner now, but it'll probably raise its ugly head again in the future. And then Whale Cove, as Dave indicated, the habitat in the subtidal and underwater and subtidal and intertidal is protected. And we acquired the remaining lands around the cove to protect the resources there. There are seabirds that breed there, harbor seals that haul out, and it also protects the scenic value of US Highway 101 there. So just a view of a few of the critters that use the refuges. These are common murres again. This is a colony, one of the colonies at Yaquina Head. And where we have large numbers of seabirds, we have bald eagles that pursue seabirds for food. Here an eagle is lifting a murre off and taking to its nest to feed its young. Brandt's cormorants in their breeding plumage, you can see the plumes out of the back of their back and the sides of their face. These are all males that are advertising, trying to attract a female to a site to breed. We see pelagic cormorants all along the coast breeding on the refuges. And I like this shot because most often when you look at cormorants from a distance, they just look like big blackbirds. But when you get them in the right sunlight, they actually have this really beautiful iridescence to them. And pigeon guillemots is another species that takes advantage of the refuge rocks and islands. They also breed along the mainland at sites. And this is their breeding plumage where they're all black. In the wintertime, they're mostly white with some black, but we rarely get to see that because they pretty much stay offshore during the wintertime. And then black oyster catchers breed in rocky areas. They forage in rocky intertidal on marine invertebrates. This is the male who's incubating its second egg that has not hatched yet, and this other chick is waiting for its first meal. And then we also have a variety of wildlife that use the refuge that they do not breed here. These are surf birds that are foraging in the rocky intertidal, and then at high tide, of course, they're up roosting on the rocks and islands. There's also black turnstones, rock sandpipers, and then there are species like Harlequin Ducks, one of my favorite. They forage in the intertidal and subtidal areas, and then they haul out on the rocks and islands to roost and preen and take care of themselves. So, and where we have, lots of these smaller birds, we also have predatory birds such as peregrine falcons, once an endangered species that now has fully recovered and is in fact breeding on the refuge. So there are some quite a few success stories out there involved in endangered species effort. And marine mammals using the refuge, Oregon has the largest breeding population of stellar sea lions in U.S. waters south of Alaska. This rock-out road reef can produce anywhere from 500 to 1,000 pups a year. And this is a picture of Shell Island on the Simpson Reef near Cape Arago. Huge salt haul-out site. We have California sea lions here, stellar sea lions, northern elephant seals, harbor seals, and I think ODF&W aerial surveys on one day had more than 7,000 animals here at one time, 1 year. And of course, a picture of harbor seals that we see all up and down along the coastline. And lastly, a nice view from Coquille Point. If you haven't been there, you should try to visit sometime. That's it for me.
Roy, thank you so much for your vast knowledge and your absolutely stunning photos. Thank the entire panel for outstanding presentations, and I will open it up to the audience. We'll take questions if you can post them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll let the panelists answer them. So I have one right off. I'll start. I don't know who wants to answer it, but what agency is responsible for managing the seabird protection area off Cape Perpetua? Is it the only one on the Oregon coast?
I guess I could start on that. So the seabird protection area is part of our Marine Reserve, Marine Protected Area system, and that particular area has regulations that prohibit fishing of forage fish species that the seabirds feed on. So that's really the main management measure for that area. It's certainly the only thing in Oregon called a seabird protection area. Of course, offshore rocks protect seabirds. I mean, there's other areas and designations that protect seabirds, but this is the only one that has that name and has that particular management measure.
Yeah, I will say that Dave is correct. The state manages that seabird protection area, and basically they're managing the resources there. In terms of seabirds and other migratory birds, wherever they occur across the country, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the federal agency that has the management of that species, and internationally, because many of these birds travel between countries. So the birds themselves fall under our management. We co-manage with the states, but the actual seabird protection area is managed, as Dave said, by the state.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Which seabird populations are healthy and stable, and which, like the tufted puffin, are in decline?
Let's see. So having retired 5 years ago, I'm a little out of touch with some of the more new information, but we know that tufted puffin has declined by perhaps 95%. I mean, it's just incredible how it's just vanished, and there's no carcasses, there's no smoking gun. We don't have a good idea yet what has caused it, but we know that I showed a picture of the bald eagle carrying the myrrh off that colony, and to everyone's surprise, including me, they've had a much greater impact than anyone figured was possible. And we started seeing this in the early 90s, and it's not so much them taking an individual bird, it's when they come into a colony now, the myrrhs are so freaked out that they all panic off the rocks and islands, and you have crows and ravens and gulls eating the chicks and eggs and turkey vultures. So we've seen a decline of a number of common myrrhs on the north coast. They're also beginning to see an increase in the number on the south coast because we have much fewer eagles down there, or at least eagles in the marine environment. So, but I would have to say that I believe that the common myrrh population is declining because most of the North Coast colonies are unable to produce young anymore. And these birds are long-lived, many, many years. So we're just getting to the point where they're not, they're falling out of the population. And so I believe we're probably in a decline of common myrrhs. The other populations, they fluctuate with ocean productivity. So it takes some really long-term studies to really know what population level is doing in terms of cormorants and things like that.
We have time for a couple more questions, and one from the audience is from Joseph. With the patchwork of agency responsibility for rocky habitats, who monitors habitat quality, and is there a formal method for adaptive management?
I guess I'll volunteer to start on that one. It's a pretty broad question. There's a number of programs that monitor marine habitat off of Oregon. One of the principal ones is our Marine Reserves program. So our Marine Reserves program has which is now going on a 10-year program for monitoring habitat and species and diversity and those types of things, in the marine reserves, in the protected area, and then some adjacent areas that they call comparison areas. Our Department of Fish and Wildlife also has a number of programs that do surveys off the coast. We do some habitat surveys, and it's not quite as formal or systematic as the Marine Reserves program, but we do a number of surveys that shed light on habitat quality. In intertidal areas, there's a number of programs run by universities that do long-term monitoring. Some of them up to now over 20-year-old monitoring programs at a number of sites up and down, not just in Oregon, the whole West Coast. Formal method for adaptive management. I mean, it depends, there's so many different definitions of that and so many different degrees of formality, but in general, our management, looks at conditions, looks at current conditions, looks at, kind of future changes and tries to address those. So it's adaptive in that sense. I'm not sure what a more formal method is, but we definitely adapt our management to address issues or impacts or condition changes over time. I'll let other panels add to that.
I'll just add to it that I think that management and adaptive management has increased over the years, especially recent years, just due to I think some of the attention that the Marine Reserves have brought to coastline. And I think the fact that there is organized monitoring going on in the reserves, and the fact that there have been some very noted die-offs. The sea star wasting disease, certainly in the rocky intertidal areas, has brought a lot of attention and has focused some attention on some, as Dave mentioned, some long-term research and monitoring efforts that are going on by universities, both within Oregon as well as more broadly along the West Coast. And so I think now there's more access to this information, and people are looking at it more carefully. And as we all know, we all have access to computers. We can actually access this data ourselves as individuals. So I think there's much greater ability now to do this adaptive management, and not just counting as things decline, but actually to begin to take some steps to figure out what's going on. So I am encouraged by seeing some of this more collaboration that's going on between agencies and universities and other groups too.
Dick, you'd mentioned sea star wasting, and one of the questions in the chat is, for all the panelists, are there any invertebrates that are of particular concern?
Well, there's a lot of concern about invertebrates. I think the one thing that I think people always are surprised to find out is that sea stars are major predators. There's a lot of invertebrates that, of course, are predators, and so we have concerns when these predators either decline dramatically or they increase dramatically, as we've seen with urchins as well. So there certainly are people again watching these things and realizing that there are these, not only are some of these changes are due to events that we would like to maybe attribute to climate change. We certainly have noted some of these declines related to the warm water blob occurrences, but I think people are certainly looking at invertebrates in general and watching these populations because they are true indicators of our ocean health in general.
I will add quickly too that I think now the poster child for sea star wasting is the sunflower star, or Pictopodia, and it has been listed as ICUN, International Conservation. I don't know. It's listed as a kind of threatened species under that, and also NOAA is currently entering in a process to consider it for potential listing under the Endangered Species Act. That's a 12-month process, so it'll be a while before we know the outcome of that. But it's serious enough that it's being considered under the Endangered Species Act.
We have time for maybe one more question, and that asks, with the state of Oregon entering rulemaking on drones in state parks and ocean shore, what concerns are there regarding impact of drones in the areas of wildlife? And I think all three of you can talk extensively on that one.
I think we're all looking at Roy on that one, because we certainly think that they're going to be flushing birds. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, it's already an issue on the refuge rocks and islands and other refuges and national parks with these low flying aircraft. And we've seen some on YouTube, and our law enforcement people have tried to track down people because you can see the drones flying by and gulls chasing them and stuff, thinking it's an eagle. And yeah, we really need to keep drones back. Drones could be a good tool for monitoring if they're used right, but hovering 10 feet above a seabird colony is not appropriate use. So there's efforts underway to keep them. Well, it's already illegal to fly over refuge lands, so we're really concerned about drones, and the more we can restrict their use in those sensitive areas, the better off we'll be.
We've got one more question in here, and that would be, can you draw any parallels between returning top predators to land-based ecosystems and the reintroduction of sea otters?
Well, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, I was just going to say that's to really fully describe that's we would need an hour webinar just to do that, but just briefly, it's very parallel, where you have a keystone predator, a top level predator that has disproportionate effects on the ecosystem. And the kind of the classic example with sea otters is sea otters will help limit the sea urchin population. Sea urchins are the major grazer on kelp, so limiting those populations increases the health of kelp bed. So that's kind of a really short nutshell of kind of the classic example.
And I was just going to add too, I think that sea otters, of course, are very photogenic and obvious predators that we've eliminated from the Oregon coast. There are many other ones that we don't see as readily. I'll talk about whales and sharks and things like that. We just have, as well as some other major predators. And I think that the fact is that we have quite disrupted these systems, and that these disruptions are evident, and then they are kind of exacerbated by some of the climate change impacts now too. So it's kind of hard to tease apart which is becoming more of the issue, but certainly the loss of these major predators is pretty important factor. And I think with regards to some of these species, we have seen that we can effectively begin to restore them. Roy brought forward a couple of the birds that been brought forward and have been restored to some level. So I think there are possibilities there.
Well, thank all of the panel so much. And Jesse, do you want to give any closing comments?
This was wonderful. I learned a lot. I'm excited to be sharing this with others. I'm grateful that this could be recorded. So thank you.
Well, if we could hear applause in Zoom, it would be loud. Thank you all so much for your participation, and thank the audience for listening in. And I hope to see you all on January 12th for our next presentation. Thank you so much to the panelists, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks all.